Hey everyone, I'm the narrator, and I'm here to help you out today. I know you're using this video to sleep, so before you do, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling me where you're from and what time it is when you're watching. Now, just get comfy and relax. On March 12, 1987, Ethan and Rachel, a young couple in search of peace and tranquility, moved to an isolated house in a small town in California, hoping to escape the hustle and bustle of urban life. After months of searching, they finally found the property that seemed like the perfect opportunity to restart their lives. Located in a remote area, far from the city and the noise of civilization, the house was surrounded by a large plot of land with tall trees that seemed to protect the building from the pressures of the outside world. Upon arrival, the house presented itself as a cozy retreat. Its exterior, marked by the charm of old constructions, had faded paint but was still intact. The roof, although aged, was firm, and the dark wooden windows reflected the sunlight with a comforting softness. As they stepped through the front door, a sense of quietness immediately took over them both. The interior of the house was immense, with spacious rooms and wooden floors that creaked softly underfoot. The smell of old wood and fresh country air filled Rachel's nostrils, and she felt an immediate sense of peace. It was the environment she and Ethan had been searching for so long. The house, indeed, seemed perfect for starting a new life. The living room was decorated with simple yet tasteful furniture, and the walls were adorned with old portraits that seemed to tell stories of past generations. There was something unusual, however, that caught Rachel's attention right away. In the entrance hall, a wooden door led to the basement, but what made her hesitate was a mysterious warning stamped on the wood of the door. The warning was faded, its words almost illegible due to the wear of time, but the phrase that could be read clearly was, "Beware of what you don't see." Rachel stood still for a moment, observing the inscription, but Ethan, not paying much attention to the detail, simply shrugged and suggested that it was just an old warning, perhaps left by some previous resident with superstitions. Rachel, with her slightly sharper intuition, felt uneasy about it but decided to move forward, believing that the place deserved a chance to show its true essence. In the first few days, everything seemed calm and peaceful. The couple quickly adapted to the routine of the house. During the day, sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the environment and creating a welcoming atmosphere. The sound of the wind passing through the trees felt like a soft melody that soothed the soul. However, as the days went by, small details began to catch Rachel's attention. At night, when everything was silent, she began to hear a faint creaking from the upper floor, as if the weight of the years was pressing down on the old wood of the upper floor. Although Ethan, who was more rational and skeptical, tried to reassure her, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The house, although beautiful and cozy, seemed to hide something. But what could it be? She couldn't say for sure, but she felt there was something behind the apparent tranquility. On a particularly quiet night, while the couple was in the living room, Rachel noticed a soft sound coming from one of the rooms on the upper floor. It was a sound like light footsteps, but the house was empty, and Ethan was there with her, in the living room. The sound continued, but when she got up to investigate, it suddenly stopped. Rachel felt uncomfortable but tried to convince herself that it could just be the natural noise of an old house. Ethan, as always, suggested that she was just imagining things, and she decided to ignore what she had heard. However, that feeling wouldn't let her rest. In the following days, the noises became more frequent. At night, the footsteps from the upper floor returned, accompanied by creaks as if the house were alive, adjusting to their presence. The tension built up in the air, and Rachel found herself growing more and more restless. Although she tried to rationalize what was happening, the feeling of being watched persisted. It was as if the house were full of secrets that she couldn't understand. On a cold morning, after a particularly strange night, Rachel woke up before Ethan and decided to take a walk around the garden. The fresh air and the sound of birds helped calm her, but something else caught her attention. As she walked through the exterior, she noticed that a part of the garden, near the wall, seemed darker than the rest of the yard. Something in the ground seemed out of place. She crouched down and realized that what she thought was a stone was actually a piece of wood, partially buried. Curious, she removed the wood from the ground, revealing a small rusted metal plaque with partially faded writing. As she tried to clean off the dirt, she managed to read only one word: entrance. She felt a chill. What did this mean? A secret entrance? Or just another curious and unexplained detail? When Rachel showed the piece to Ethan, he didn't take it seriously, thinking it was just another of his wife's whims. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was being hidden in that house. She felt a growing pressure, as if the house were sucking her energy and making her more tense with each passing moment. The place, which once seemed to be the definition of peace, now exuded something disturbing, a sense that they were not alone. Something or someone was watching them, and Rachel no longer knew what to think. When night fell again, she and Ethan prepared to sleep, but Rachel couldn't relax. A sudden chill enveloped her, as if the temperature in the room had dropped drastically. She looked out the window, and the wind seemed strong, but the house was sealed, with no visible draft. What was happening? Before she could think more about it, she heard a faint sound, like something scratching the wall of the room. It wasn't a natural sound. It was rhythmic, almost as if someone was trying to get their attention. Rachel wanted to scream, but fear paralyzed her. Ethan, for his part, was completely oblivious to it, as if the house was driving Rachel to the edge of madness. Despite the increasing tension, Ethan insisted that Rachel was just exaggerating. He reassured her, saying the house was old and that these sounds were common. But something inside Rachel told her he was wrong. And soon, she would discover just how wrong he was. The house had much more to hide, and the mysteries that were beginning to unfold were just the beginning of a series of events that would later force them to face something they could never have imagined. That night, when the strange sound ceased, Rachel still couldn't sleep. Her eyes were fixed on the ceiling, trying to understand what was happening, but all she could feel was a deep discomfort, a sensation that something was about to happen, something that would change everything. It was an oppressive feeling, as if the house was about to reveal itself completely. But the questions that arose in her mind were disturbing. What was really happening in that house? And the warning on the basement door, what did it mean? By ignoring that warning, the couple didn't know they had started a dangerous journey, a journey in which the secrets of the house would slowly come to light. And in the end, those secrets would become the key to their own survival. After a night marked by nightmares and muffled whispers that seemed to emanate from the walls of the house, Rachel woke with the feeling that something was very wrong. The morning seemed calm, with the sun gently coming through the windows, but the atmosphere inside the house carried a palpable tension. She got up before Ethan, who was still immersed in a deep sleep, possibly unaware of his wife's growing discomfort. Rachel, with a knot in her stomach, decided to go out to the garden, hoping the fresh air might ease her anxiety. But as she walked through the grounds, what she felt wasn't relief, but a growing sense of oppression. She looked at the large oak tree in the center of the garden and, without intending to, found herself staring at a spot where the earth seemed to have been recently disturbed. Something about that spot seemed out of place. As she approached, her gaze fell upon the ground a little lower than the tree, where a stone partially buried under the foliage caught her attention. Without hesitation, she crouched to investigate. As she removed the earth, she found a carved piece of wood, already partially worn by time, and when she cleaned it, a small metal plaque was revealed. The metal was covered in rust, but the inscription she was able to read was enough to send chills down her spine. Entrance. What did this mean? What could be buried there, under that tree? Rachel looked behind her, feeling the sensation of being watched, but the grounds were empty, silent. She quickly hid the piece back, fearing that something or someone might be watching her. When Rachel showed the piece to Ethan, he looked at her skeptically. He didn't know what she was looking for, but he felt that her obsession with the little details was starting to affect her. He tried to convince her that the house was old and full of quirks, but Rachel felt that this was much more than just old things. The warning on the basement door, the strange metal plaque in the garden, Something wasn't right. She knew that, but she couldn't prove anything yet. Ethan, for his part, although feeling the same unease, wasn't willing to believe that their house was more than a historical structure, like any other. That night, things took a more disturbing turn. The couple was having dinner when Rachel heard the familiar sound of footsteps from the upper floor again. But this time, the sound didn't come from upstairs as in previous nights. Now, the noise seemed to come from the basement, a light, repetitive sound, as if someone was walking around down there, even though neither of them had gone to the basement that night. Rachel tried to ignore it, convincing herself it was just the house adjusting to the cold night air. However, the sound grew louder until it became impossible to ignore. She abruptly stood up and looked toward the basement door, which was slightly ajar. The light passing under the door seemed weaker, as if something was blocking the entrance. What could be there? Ethan noticed the alarmed look on his wife's face and, reluctantly, agreed to investigate, but only to dismiss any irrational thoughts Rachel might have. They approached the door, and the sound stopped immediately. Silence took over the house, but the tension was palpable. With the lantern in hand, Ethan descended the stairs to the basement. With each step, the air seemed heavier, denser, as if it was pulling them down. When they reached the last step, the basement was empty, except for some old boxes and furniture covered with white sheets. The smell of mold and old wood filled the air, and the feeling of claustrophobia increased with every second. Ethan looked around, but there was nothing unusual. Rachel, who followed him, was tense, her eyes quickly moving from corner to corner, trying to catch any sign of something strange. They found nothing. Nothing but the old relics of the past that seemed to hold more than just dust. But just as Ethan was about to turn around and go back up the stairs, something caught his attention. In the corner of the basement, almost imperceptible, was a small wooden box. It wasn't big, but it was well hidden, partially covered by a pile of old newspapers. Curious, Ethan approached and, with Rachel's help, removed the box from its hiding place. When they opened it, what they found inside was something they could never have expected, a collection of letters and an old diary. Rachel picked up the diary and began flipping through the pages. The handwriting was hard to read, as the paper had aged and been stained by time, but some words were still legible. The diary spoke of a man named Harold, who had lived in the house decades earlier. As Rachel read Harold's words, she became more and more intrigued. He described a growing sense of fear and unease. He spoke of a presence that followed him, something he called the entity, which seemed to feed on his energy. With each page, Harold's story became stranger and more disturbing. He mentioned that, before he mysteriously disappeared, he had tried to leave clues for the next resident, warning them about what lurked inside the house. "Don't go into the basement at night," said one of the messages. "The house demands something in return. Don't ignore the warnings, or you'll be the next to pay the price." When Rachel read these words, her body went cold. She wanted to discuss everything with Ethan, but he was more interested in the letters that were also in the box. They were from other people who had somehow been connected to the house, but their stories were even more disconnected and tragic. Each letter spoke of an invisible presence that seemed to dominate the minds of past inhabitants, driving them to make insane decisions, as if they were under a spell. The same feeling of being watched, of being driven to the edge of madness, permeated the pages written with growing anguish. Ethan, for his part, didn't know what to think. He wanted to believe those words were nothing but the delirium of people who had lost their sanity at some point. But Rachel couldn't ignore what was right in front of her. Everything seemed to be falling into place. The strange sounds, the warning on the basement door, the feeling of being watched, and now the diary that confirmed her suspicions. Something was happening in that house. Something that neither she nor Ethan could control. That night, as they tried to sleep, the sound of footsteps upstairs returned, louder than ever. Now, the sound wasn't of simple footsteps but of a presence crawling, as if it were approaching their bedroom. Rachel gripped Ethan's hand tightly, and for the first time, he began to feel the weight of the situation. The fear he had ignored until then was now becoming impossible to avoid. But what was really happening in the house? Why had no one ever mentioned the true story behind its walls? The questions piled up, and the answers seemed more and more distant. They looked around, the lantern lighting up the dark corners and revealing what appeared to be old furniture covered in sheets, piles of dusty boxes, and the wooden floor creaking beneath their feet. But in one corner of the basement, something caught Rachel's attention. There was a part of the floor that was slightly raised, as if it were hiding something beneath it. She didn't know why, but something inside her urged her to go there. When they lifted it, the sound of cracking would echo through the basement, and beneath the raised floor, there was an opening, a passage. What was down there? What had Harold seen? What was he so afraid of? Rachel stood frozen for a moment, the weight of what they were about to uncover pressing down on her. Ethan seemed to share her unease, but his curiosity overpowered his fear. They hesitated, but then descended into the dark passage, each step feeling like it was taking them deeper into the unknown. The air was thick with dust and a strange, heavy silence that made their breathing feel unnatural. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the air became. The walls seemed to close in around them, and the sound of their footsteps reverberated eerily through the passage. At the end of the narrow corridor, the passage widened into a small room. The walls were damp and covered with old, peeling wallpaper. In the center of the room was an altar-like stone structure, surrounded by melted candle stubs, their wicks long since burned out. The flickering light of the lantern cast ominous shadows, stretching across the walls like dark fingers reaching out to grab them. Ethan and Rachel stood there, staring at the stone altar. It looked ancient, worn by time, but it exuded a palpable energy that made the hairs on the back of Rachel's neck stand on end. It was as if the stone itself was alive, waiting for something. Rachel's eyes scanned the room, searching for anything that might explain its existence. Her heart raced in her chest, and her breath became shallow as she realized that this was the place Harold had warned about. This was the heart of the house's dark secret. Then, Rachel noticed something strange in the corner of the room. There was an old wooden chest, half hidden under a pile of discarded cloths. The chest seemed to beckon her, as if it held the answers they had been seeking. Her hands trembled as she approached it, her pulse pounding in her ears. With a shaky breath, she opened the chest, the creaking of the lid echoing in the silence. Inside, there was a bundle of old yellowed papers, tied together with a faded ribbon. Rachel carefully untied the bundle and began to sift through the papers. Her hands were cold as she unfolded the first page. The handwriting was jagged and uneven, as if written in haste. It was a journal, much like Harold's, but this one was written by someone else, someone who had lived in the house long before him. The journal was filled with unsettling accounts of strange occurrences, objects moving on their own, unexplained sounds, and a growing sense of dread that seemed to overtake the residents. The last entry was the most chilling. "The house is alive," it read. "It feeds on the fear of those who live here, and it will not let us leave. The basement is the source of its power. It waits for us to give it what it wants." Rachel's heart sank as she read the words. She had no doubt now that the house was not just old and full of quirks, it was something far more sinister. It was a place of malevolent energy, and whatever had happened to the previous residents was slowly happening to her and Ethan as well. Ethan, who had been silent throughout the ordeal, finally spoke. "We need to leave. Now." Rachel nodded, her mind racing with the implications of what they had just discovered. But even as they turned to leave the room, the air around them seemed to shift, growing heavier, as if the house itself was unwilling to let them go. The temperature dropped suddenly, and Rachel shivered, her breath visible in the cold air. Something was watching them. As they made their way back to the basement stairs, the noise they had heard earlier, the scraping, the whispering, returned louder than ever. Rachel could feel it closing in, and as she glanced behind her, she could almost make out shapes moving in the shadows, shapes that shouldn't have been there. "Come on," Ethan urged, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the stairs. They hurried back up the stairs, but the sense of being pursued, of something following them, grew stronger with every step. As they reached the top of the stairs, the door to the basement slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping them inside. Ethan tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. He pounded on it, but the house seemed to resist his every effort, as if it didn't want them to leave. Rachel turned to him, panic rising in her chest. "We're trapped," Ethan cursed under his breath. "We need to find another way out." But as they looked around the dark, silent house, the oppressive weight of the air began to close in again. Rachel could feel it, like something was pulling them toward the heart of the house, toward the basement where the answers and the terror awaited. It was only a matter of time before they would face whatever it was that had been haunting the house for so long. And as the house seemed to pulse with a life of its own, Rachel realized that there was no escape. The house had claimed them, just as it had claimed Harold and every other person who had ever lived there. The only question now was how much longer they would survive. Rachel looked at Ethan, her eyes reflecting the fear she felt. Ethan, with a pale face, knew there was no turning back now. They had reached the point of no return. And as they descended into what seemed like a new level of terror, the house would finally begin to reveal its true face. What awaited them down there? Something much older and much more dangerous than they could have imagined. Reluctantly, the basement door slowly opened. The creaking sound reverberated through the walls of the house, echoing in the heavy silence of the night. The air that came out was cold, almost icy, and felt dense, as if it were not just a gust of wind but a presence waiting, patiently, for a long time. Rachel and Ethan stood frozen for a moment, immersed in the feeling that what lay beyond the door was more than just a physical space. It was something else, something that transcended the very structure of the house, something that had been kept there, waiting, perhaps, for this exact moment. The door opened fully, and what they saw ahead was not a simple basement like any other, but a narrow, dark stone corridor, where the walls were made of damp, cold rocks that seemed to breathe with the house. The corridor stretched farther than either of them had expected. The smell of mold, combined with the pungent aroma of wet earth, filled their noses, but what disturbed them more was the sense of density in the air. With every step they took, it felt as though the weight of the walls around them was increasing, as if the house were drawing them deeper, deeper still. There was something in that passage, something that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the house. The sound of their footsteps echoed like a distant murmur, reflected in the dark stones of the corridor. Each movement made the environment feel more vast, more expansive than it really was. Rachel looked at Ethan, his face illuminated only by the lantern he held. She didn't need to speak for him to understand the fear in her eyes. The terror creeping into her mind wasn't just from the darkness or the physical structure of the house, but from the sense that they were getting closer to something beyond their understanding. The air seemed colder as they walked. The stone floor, uneven and broken in many places, seemed to absorb the lantern's light, making the outlines of the corridor nearly invisible. There was a constant pressure on them, as if every step they took toward the darkness was an invitation to something unknown. The silence was absolute, but paradoxically, it seemed filled with something else. The feeling that they were being watched began to overtake Rachel, but Ethan, maintaining his rational posture, tried to focus only on what lay ahead of them. Yet Rachel's instinct pushed her to look back, growing more uncomfortable. Something seemed to follow them, something invisible, but just as present as the shadow of their own figures projected on the wall. When they reached the end of the corridor, a rusty iron door appeared before them, like a definitive barrier between the world they knew and what was about to be revealed. The door was covered in rust, its hinges creaking with the slightest pressure, as though they were about to give way at any moment. Ethan's lantern wavered in his hand, the flickering light casting shadows on the surrounding walls as he hesitated, feeling that something was wrong. There was a sense of finality, of a boundary, something that kept them from moving forward, but also pulled them into the unknown. Even in her growing terror, Rachel knew that the only way to find the truth was to move forward. The house wouldn't leave them in peace until that was done. She had no words. The weight of the moment was almost unbearable. She looked at Ethan, and with a silent gesture, signaled that he should open the door. He moved to turn the rusty doorknob. When the door gave way, the sound of the metal scraping against the corridor walls was muffled, as though something was trying to silence the moment. The door opened slowly, with a long, painful creak, revealing a space larger than they had imagined. The environment was vast, with a dirt floor that seemed to have been there for centuries, unchanged, untouched. Shelves made of old wood were scattered throughout the room, some broken, others still intact, filled with objects covered in dust. In the center of the room was something neither of them could have imagined. A large, rounded stone, smooth and polished, like an altar. The stone was surrounded by remnants of melted and extinguished candles, but the circles left by the flames were clearly visible, marking the area around the stone with a sense of reverence that wasn't natural. The room was enveloped in an almost oppressive darkness, and Ethan's lantern seemed insufficient to illuminate every corner. The shadows appeared alive, moving on the walls as if they had a mind of their own. But what truly made both of them stop at the entrance, paralyzed, was the mural on the opposite wall. The figures, intricately carved into the stone, seemed more than just symbols or drawings. They were like a living record of something that had happened there, something deeply rooted in the house's past. Rachel approached, drawn to the symbols that seemed to pulse as she neared. The lines and shapes etched into the stones formed a nearly perfect circle, and at the center of the mural, a large eye was depicted, its contours intense and deep, surrounded by spirals, as if the gaze itself was the key to understanding everything. It was a disconcerting figure, as if the mural itself were alive, watching her with an almost conscious perception. Ethan, feeling the same growing pressure in his chest, approached the mural cautiously. The words, written along the edges, were distorted but still legible. He tried to read, but couldn't make sense of anything. It was as if the words, the symbols, were in a language he had never seen before, but paradoxically, he felt like he recognized it. Something inside him, something primitive and instinctual, was warning him not to delve any deeper. But he was beyond the point of no return. What was this mural? And why did it seem like it was drawing him in? Rachel, with her eyes fixed on the mural, read the words aloud, but with each syllable, something in the house seemed to move. The sound of something scraping, almost as if a creature were dragging itself, echoed through the walls around them. Beside the mural, a more recent inscription caught Rachel's attention. It was covered by a thin layer of dust, almost as if it had been purposely hidden. The words, still legible, read with disturbing clarity, "They are coming. We can't escape." The sentence resonated with such intensity that the lantern in her hands flickered, as if something was trying to extinguish the light from their lives. Rachel looked at Ethan, her eyes conveying the terror she was feeling. This wasn't just a warning, it was a direct message for them. But what did it mean? What was coming? Rachel looked back, feeling a chill spread down her spine, and before she could say anything, she heard a sound. Something moving in the shadows. Something that hadn't been there before. The air grew thicker. The sound grew louder, closer. Something was approaching them. Something that had been waiting for the moment to be discovered. The basement door slammed shut with a sudden bang, and the lantern's light flickered. The feeling of being watched intensified, becoming palpable. The silence took over the place, but it wasn't a normal silence. It was a silence that pressed, that seeped into their minds, distorting the perception of what was real. Fear overwhelmed both of them, like a tidal wave, but they couldn't escape. Something had reached them. The house was alive, and they were just two souls trapped in a destiny they could no longer control. The house had closed in around them. What was waiting in the depths of its shadows, in the walls that were watching them, was something much older and much more terrifying than they could have imagined. The silence after the door's crash was absolute, an almost deafening silence, filled with an oppressive feeling that something immense and unfathomable was about to be revealed. Ethan and Rachel were frozen, their hearts beating out of sync, each breath harder than the last. The light from the lantern wavered in Ethan's hand, as if it were being sucked into the darkness that now seemed to envelop them completely. The warmth of the house, the warmth of everyday life, was fading, replaced by a chilling cold that seemed to emanate from the stones around them, as if the very structure of the house was draining all the vitality from the surroundings. Rachel, her eyes wide and hands trembling, looked at Ethan but couldn't find any words. He, in turn, was trying to understand what was happening, but a sense of helplessness took over him. He had faced many challenges, but nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for what lay ahead. The mural on the wall, the words carved into the stones, all seemed part of a bigger, darker story than either of them could comprehend. The lantern began to sway violently, casting dancing shadows on the basement walls, as if something was moving in the depths of the darkness. But the sound that Ethan and Rachel heard was no longer the echo of their own footsteps. It was something heavier, more dragging, as if something were crawling on the floor, coming toward them. The sound grew louder, faster, and it was then that absolute terror took over them. There was no more doubt. They were not alone. Something was there, something not human, something that didn't belong to this world, something that had hidden in the shadows of the house for so long. A force, a presence, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. It was as if the house had been built around this thing, as if everything had been made to hide, protect, imprison an entity that was now about to be unleashed. Ethan took a step back, almost without thinking, and Rachel instinctively followed him. But before they could move any further, a deep rumble came from the center of the room. The stone, the altar, seemed to pulse, as if something was being activated. The shadows around the room began to stretch, twist, and contort, as if the darkness itself were becoming a living being, trying to break free from the prison it had been in. The symbols on the mural seemed to glow faintly, as if they were coming to life, as if they were calling something into existence. "We can't leave," Rachel said, her voice faltering, as she looked at the door, which was now sealed shut. She felt that the house was closing in around them, and the feeling of being watched was becoming unbearable. Something, some power, was controlling what was happening here. They couldn't escape. They were trapped inside a labyrinth of shadows, and every movement seemed to bring only more darkness. As Ethan looked at the mural, he realized that these weren't just ancient symbols or artifacts from a forgotten culture. No, this was a warning. The circle, the eye, the spirals, everything was connected. It was like a portal, a convergence point of forces that they didn't understand. But Harold's words, the previous occupant, echoed in his mind. "I saw what's in the basement. I saw what should never have been seen." At that moment, Ethan's lantern went out. The darkness took over the room immediately, and the only thing left was their heavy breathing, the sound of their hearts beating uncontrollably. An immense pressure, a sense of suffocation, surrounded them. Something was watching them. Something had freed itself from the prison of shadows and was now walking among them. Then the sound, a deep and guttural noise, began to fill the room. It was no longer just dragging, but a threatening presence, a sound that reverberated deep within their souls. The walls began to tremble slightly, as if the house were adjusting, changing, being molded by an invisible force. And in the center of this force, something emerged. At first, it was just a dark shape, a vague silhouette, writhing in the air. But as the darkness spread, the figure began to gain consistency, a thick, fluid mass that seemed made of shadow itself. It had no defined shape, but its contours were sharp. Whatever it was, it wasn't human. It was something older, more primal. Rachel's eyes widened as she realized that the shape wasn't a physical creature. It was the very essence of the house, the energy that had been imprisoned there for so long. "Ethan," Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. "What is this?" Ethan, in panic, took a step back, but there was nowhere to go. The house had trapped them. He tried to focus, trying to understand what was happening, but the sight before him was beyond any rational explanation. The shadow forming in front of them seemed to feed off the light, the energy around it, as if it were an entity that nourished itself from existence itself. With each breath, the darkness around them grew thicker. Then Rachel remembered Harold's words from the journal. The house demands something in return. She knew it wasn't just a metaphor. The house, in some way, needed a sacrifice, and she was beginning to understand that this sacrifice wasn't just a symbolic offering. It was real. The sacrifice was needed so that the entity in the basement could be fed, so that it could grow stronger. Ethan, his face pale and eyes wide, started to retreat, but his feet felt glued to the floor, as if the house had taken control of his body. Rachel tried to scream, but her voice was muffled, as if the house was swallowing her words. The creature, or whatever it was coming closer, and as Rachel looked at it, she felt as if her own thoughts were being consumed. The shadow seemed to enter her mind, spreading a darkness so deep that she could no longer distinguish what was real and what wasn't. The house, the entity, all of it had been a plan devised over time. They weren't the first to discover the secret hidden there, and they certainly wouldn't be the last. The basement, the stone, the symbols, everything was interconnected in an ancient ritual, a cycle that repeated whenever the inhabitants ignored the signs. Harold had been the last to try to escape, but he had failed. Now, it was Ethan and Rachel's turn, and the entity was stronger than ever. When Ethan tried to scream, his voice was silenced by the pressure of the house. The entity wasn't something physical that they could fight. It was a presence that invaded the mind, distorted perception, made thoughts fade into the darkness. There was no way out. They were trapped there, at the mercy of something much older, much more powerful than they could comprehend. And then a shrill sound filled the basement. It was no longer the sound of the entity, but something new, something that seemed to come from within them. A feeling of despair took over Rachel. There was no more time. The house had won, and there was no escape.